Firstly, before I say anything else, thank you so much for 10,000 subscribers. Honestly, you can probably tell from how smiley I am, but I'm so over the moon. I can't believe it. I literally only started doing these videos in March, and at the time I had 13 subscribers when I posted my first true crime video in March of this year. And now to be in August and have 10,000 subscribers is insane. Just thank you so much. I'm going to try not to get emotional about it, but just thank you so much to everyone that subscribed, everyone that likes, everyone that comments, everyone that sends me messages. I literally appreciate it so much, and yeah, I honestly don't know what to say because it's just crazy. Just quickly before I actually get into today's video, I just want to let you guys know that I have now launched a Patreon page. A lot of people have been asking me lately if I have a Patreon because they'd be really interested in supporting me that little bit further over on there, which is crazy to me. So I just thought, now that I've hit 10,000 subscribers, I'm gonna launch a Patreon. So if anyone is interested in supporting me just that little bit more over on my Patreon, I will leave the link in the description of this video. If you do decide to become a Patreon, honestly, it means so much to me. Thank you so much. Just as a little kind of thank you to anyone who may become a Patreon, you do get quite a few advantages and like little perks, such as you get access to all of my videos a day earlier than anyone else. You get access to like a discussion board where we can like discuss my upcoming cases. You can like request cases and your request will kind of take priority over everyone else's because you are a Patreon. I'm going to be doing Patreon only live streams and polls, and you can like vote on which cases you want to see next. You'll also get kind of extra behind the scenes footage of what I'm up to day to day, how I plan my mystery videos, how I film my videos, what kind of equipment I use. So if you're interested in becoming a Patreon, like I said before, I will leave the link in the description. If you do decide to become a Patreon, honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It means so much to me. Obviously, if you don't want to become a Patreon, that is absolutely fine. You don't have to at all. Even just people commenting on my videos literally means the world to me. So just thank you to everyone who is subscribed to this channel. Sorry I had a little bit of a ramble there. I just wanted to say thank you. So yeah. But anyway, now let's get into the actual video. So today we are going to be talking about the serial killer Albert Fish, and I had actually never heard of this serial killer before. This case was actually requested to me through my request a case form, so if you want to request a case, as always, go to the link in the description. But yeah, this case was requested to me through my request a case form, and I saw it and I started looking into this serial killer a bit more, and I was just like, how have I never heard of this guy? Honestly, he's one of the creepiest serial killers I have ever like looked into. Just a pre-warning before we actually get into the video, this case does involve the murder of children, and it is a very gruesome case. So if that's something that you are very sensitive to, I probably don't advise watching this video. I just want to clarify that my intent with these videos is never to offend or upset anyone that may have been involved with the case. All of the information I have found on this video has been from several different sources online, so I do apologise if anything is incorrect, or if you think that I've missed something out that's really important. As usual, please let me know in the comments. And having said all of that, let's just get into today's case. So Albert Fish was an American serial killer born Hamilton Howard Albert Fish on the 19th of May 1870 to his parents Randall and Ellen Fish in Washington, D.C. Albert's father Randall was actually 75 years old when Albert was born, and his mother Ellen was actually 43 years younger than her partner Randall. Albert was the youngest of 4 siblings. He had an older sister called Annie and 2 older brothers called Walter and Edwin. The reason that Albert preferred being called Albert instead of his actual first name Hamilton was because he wanted to be named after a deceased sibling, but also he was actually teased when he lived in an orphanage as a child, and he was called Ham and Eggs. So all the children in the orphanage would kind of tease him and call him Ham and Eggs, and so he wanted to kind of escape that nickname and be known as Albert instead. Albert's family actually had a long history of mental illness. His uncle suffered from mania, his brother was actually confined to a mental hospital, his sister was also diagnosed with mental health issues, and his mother used to actually suffer from visual hallucinations. When Albert was 5 years old, his father Randall actually passed away after suffering from a heart attack, and so his mother Ellen, now a widow, decided to put Albert and the rest of his siblings into an orphanage because she just she couldn't really cope financially or mentally bringing up children after her husband Randall died. So Albert was put into St. John's Orphanage in Washington, and his time in this orphanage was very bad. He was horrifically abused and he was subject to several brutal beatings. The caretakers of this orphanage would regularly beat up the children, but they would also encourage the children to actually beat up each other as well. And his time in the orphanage is what most people believe probably shaped him into the monster that he became later in life. However, after a few beatings, something kind of switched in Albert, and he said that instead of being scared of these beatings, he used to actually enjoy them. He began enjoying the pain that was being inflicted upon him. It was like a pleasure to him. When he was asked about his time in the orphanage later in life, Albert said, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done." When Albert was 10 years old in 1880, his mother Ellen actually managed to secure a government job, and so now she was able to take Albert and the rest of his siblings out of the orphanage. But by this point, it was already too late for Albert. He had already been mentally and physically scarred by his time in the orphanage. When Albert was 12 years old, he actually formed a relationship with a young local telegraph boy, whose name I actually don't know, so I don't believe his name is public knowledge. But this telegraph boy was a very bad influence on Albert, and he started introducing Albert to things such as drinking your own urine and eating your own feces. And the two would spend their weekends going to local bathhouses where they would watch other young boys undress and bathe themselves. When Albert was 20 years old in 1890, he actually moved to New York and started working as a male prostitute. And it was here where Albert would begin molesting young boys, and he would lure children away from their homes, torture them and rape them. In 1898, Albert was actually married and had 6 children with a woman named Anna Mary Hoffman, who was 9 years younger than him. And when Albert became a father, he actually attempted to stop what he was doing, molesting young boys, and he tried to kind of live a normal, respectable life working as a house painter. However, as you can probably guess, this didn't actually stop Albert's disgusting behaviour, and he would just continue to molest and rape young boys. Albert later said that around this time he actually went to a museum with a male lover, and it was at this museum that he became fascinated with penis bisection. He suddenly just became obsessed with sexual mutilation, and this kind of obsession drove him to fulfill his sick and twisted fantasies. It was in Wilmington in Delaware in 1910 when Albert committed his first mutilation of a 19-year-old boy named Thomas Kedden. Albert and Thomas allegedly started a relationship. However, Thomas was quite impressionable, and so most people believe that it was actually Albert forcing him into this relationship. Eventually, Albert Fish took Thomas to an old farmhouse where he kept him there and tortured him for 2 weeks. By the end of these 2 weeks of torture, Thomas was tied up, and Albert Fish actually cut off half of his penis. Albert Fish later said about this incident, "I will never forget his scream or the look he gave me." After cutting off half of his penis, Albert actually planned to murder Thomas and cut him up and take his body back home with him. However, around the time the weather was very hot, and so Albert was worried that if he killed him, the meat would spoil. So instead, Albert just poured peroxide and applied Vaseline to the wound before handing Thomas a $10 bill, giving him a kiss goodbye and leaving the farmhouse. And after that, the two never saw each other again, and Albert Fish claimed that he never knew what actually happened to Thomas. In 1917, Albert's wife, Anna Mary, actually left him for another man named John Straub, who was a handyman. I'm sorry, I'm probably not pronouncing his name right. Anna fled the home when Albert was actually at work, so he arrived home from work and found his children, but his wife had left. She had walked out on them, and so now Albert was a single parent. And after all of this with his wife, Albert actually began acting really strange, and he started having hallucinations, something that his mother had. One time, Albert actually wrapped himself up in a carpet and claimed that he was following the instructions of John the Apostle. And it was also around this time that Albert began experimenting with self-harm. Eventually, Albert became really fascinated by self-sexual mutilation, mutilation, and he started sticking and embedding needles into his own groin and abdomen, and he would also flog himself with a nail-studded ping pong paddle. So basically he had like a table tennis / ping pong paddle, whatever you call it, and he would stick needles into that and then hit himself with it. And after this whole case happened, after Albert's trial and after he was eventually found guilty, sorry I'm spoiling it a little bit, but after all this he actually told people about the fact that he used to stick needles into his groin, and I don't think people believed him. Yeah, I don't think people actually believed him, and so he had an x-ray of his pelvis and they found 29 needles embedded into that area. I do have a picture of Albert's pelvis, so if you don't want to see that, I would skip forward now like 10 seconds, but I'll put it on screen now. You can see the needles embedded in his pelvis. It's literally so gruesome and disturbing. Albert would also insert cotton wool into his anus that he had doused in lighter fluid, and he would then set alight. Although Albert would do all of this to himself, there was never any report that he was abusive towards his children. However, he would encourage his children and their friends to hit him with the nail-studded ping pong paddle. And he soon developed another fascination, this time with cannibalism. And this fascination with cannibalism led to Albert actually eating raw meat for his dinner and sometimes serving it to his children because he wanted to put an end to his desire for human flesh. Before his murders, Fish was evaluated by psychiatrists several times. However, every single time he was declared sane and just returned back into society. And over time, Fish began kind of building up and accumulating a number of weapons and devices to add to his torture collection, such as a meat cleaver, a small handsaw, and a butcher's knife. Around 1919, Albert began stabbing young men who were either mentally disabled or African American because he felt as though if he killed them, they wouldn't be missed. Albert would also pay other children to help him catch children to torture and eventually murder. However, there's never actually been any proof of this. This is just something that he claimed, so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. By 1924, Albert was suffering very, very badly from psychosis, and he was convinced that God was commanding him to torture and rape and murder children. And although he was evaluated by psychiatrists, like I said before, he was just eventually released back into society. Although I feel like you can't entirely blame psychiatrists for this really, because this was the early 1900s. People didn't understand mental health, and so it was really hard to diagnose people with disorders. On the 11th of July the same year, Albert Fish actually attempted to abduct an 8-year-old girl called Beatrice Kill, who was outside playing on her parents' farm. Beatrice was alone when Albert Fish approached her and offered her some money if she would help him go and find some rhubarb. And Beatrice agreed, and she was literally about to leave the farm when thankfully her mother came out of the house and chased Albert away. But Albert didn't give up that easily. He was determined to abduct Beatrice, and so he actually returned to the farm later that night and he tried to sleep there. However, he was discovered by Hans, Beatrice's father, who forced him to leave. Albert Fish's next attempt was on a young boy named Cyril Quinn, and he had actually been molesting Cyril for a while. Quinn and his friend were just outside playing on a sidewalk when they were approached by Albert Fish, who invited them back to his apartment for some lunch, and they accepted. Whilst the boys were waiting for Fish to make their sandwiches, they were kind of like wrestling / playing on Albert Fish's bed, when they noticed under his bed a meat cleaver, a handsaw, and a knife. So obviously the boys got really scared and freaked out, and so they ran out of Albert's apartment, and once again his attempt at trying to abduct, torture, and murder a child had failed. However, his next attempt wouldn't be so unsuccessful. On May the 28th, 1928, Albert saw a classified advertisement in the Sunday edition of the New York newspaper that read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in the country, Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. So obviously this young man who put this ad in the newspaper was looking for work. His name was Edward, and at the time his family, the Budd family, were really struggling financially, and so Edward was trying to get some work to help his father out with the finances. And so Albert Fish saw this advertisement and he decided to visit the Budd family home and offer Edward a job. Albert at this point was 58 years old, and he portrayed himself to the Budd family as just a kind of sweet, nice old man who just needed a hand around his home, and so the Budd family had no reason to suspect anything. But as you can probably guess, this wasn't Albert's intent. He didn't actually intend on offering Edward any work. He actually planned to tie Edward up, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. Albert introduced himself to the Budd family as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale in New York. Albert Fish, or Frank Howard as he was known to the Budd family, offered to take on Edward and also his friend and pay them $15 a week each to come and just help him around his home and help him on the farm. And the Budd family was so over the moon with this. They were so grateful to this old man because, like I said before, they were struggling financially, and so they really needed this. So Albert, or Frank as he was known to them, left, and he said that he would send for Edward a week later. When Albert returned a week later, he met Grace Budd, Edward's 10-year-old little sister. And when Albert met Grace, he quickly became obsessed with her, and he decided to change his victim from Edward to 10-year-old Grace instead. So to try and abduct Grace, Albert came up with a plan, and he told Grace's parents that he had to attend his niece's birthday party. And he somehow convinced Grace's parents to let Grace go with him to the birthday party. And obviously Grace, being a 10-year-old girl, was over the moon with this. She was so excited. She wanted to go to a birthday party. What child wouldn't? And her parents were charmed by Albert, or Frank as they knew him, and so they agreed to let Grace go with him. However, it would be the last time they ever saw their daughter again. Albert never returned with Grace, and so the Budd family contacted police and an investigation was launched to try and find her. However, this was 1928, and Albert obviously gave the Budd family a fake name, so it was going to be really hard for police to track this man down because they didn't know who he was. Instead of actually finding Albert, the real person who abducted Grace, the police actually arrested a 66-year-old man, Superintendent Charles Edward Pope, on suspicion of Grace's disappearance and murder, and I believe it was actually his wife who accused him of this. Charles spent 108 days in jail whilst he was awaiting his trial. However, he was ultimately found not guilty for the crime in 1930. Grace's real kidnapper, Albert Fish, wasn't even a suspect to police, and for 6 years there were no significant leads in the investigation. Then in November of 1934, 6 years after Grace Budd disappeared, an anonymous letter was sent to her mother, Delia Budd, and this letter claimed to have been from Grace's killer, which it was. Albert Fish did write the letter and he was Grace's killer. However, he never signed the letter, so it was anonymous. So I'm going to read you the whole letter that Albert wrote to Mrs. Budd, but bear in mind it is quite long, but also it's very gruesome and upsetting. In the letter, Albert describes how he murdered Grace and then what he did with her body, and it is very disturbing. So if you don't want to listen to that part, then skip to the time on the screen. But yeah, I'm going to read the letter now. Okay, so the letter said, "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body, and sold as veal cutlet brought for the highest price. John stayed there as long as he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one 7 and one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night he spanked them, tortured them to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except head, bones and guts. He was roasted in the oven, boiled, broiled, fried, stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street, rear right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, and I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me, and I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her, then I hid in the closet until she was in the room. When she saw me naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked, how she did kick, bite and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook it and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her though, I could have had I wished. She died a virgin. So that is the letter. Like I said, it is very upsetting and disgusting. Albert is literally just torturing Grace's mother about her murder, and that just shows how sick and twisted this man was. And although the letter describes Albert eating Grace's body, this has never been confirmed to have been 100% true. However, it's not surprising if he did do that given his obsession with cannibalism. Although initially police thought that this letter could have been a fake, they couldn't deny that the details in the letter about the day that Albert or Frank came to the Budds' house were very accurate. The letter was delivered in an envelope with a small hexagonal emblem on it which had the letters NYPCBA, which stands for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. So police traced this company where this envelope had come from, and they spoke to a janitor who worked for them, and this janitor told detectives that he had taken some of the company's stationery home, but some of it he had actually left at his rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street when he moved out. And the landlady of this rooming house where that janitor had left the stationery in said that just a few days earlier, Albert Fish had checked out of that exact same hotel room. She also said that Albert Fish's son had actually sent him some money, and he asked the landlady to hold the next check for him. And so now police knew that at some point Albert Fish was going to be returning to pick up this check, and so they stayed in the rooming house and just waited for him to return. When Albert eventually returned to this rooming house, police arrested him then and there, and he was taken in for questioning. However, after his arrest, Albert actually pulled out a switchblade on police. A switchblade is a type of knife, if you didn't know. But thankfully, the chief investigator of this case, William F. King, was able to wrestle this knife off of Albert. Surprisingly, in his questioning, Albert just straight up admitted that he killed Grace Budd, and he told police about the whole story, how Edward Budd, Grace's older brother, was his intended first victim. However, then when he met Grace, he changed his mind and decided to abduct and kill her instead. And just like in the letter, Albert denied raping or sexually assaulting Grace. However, he did say to his attorney that whilst he was kneeling on Grace's chest whilst he was strangling her, he ejaculated twice. And after he was arrested for the murder of Grace Budd, Albert Fish began confessing to other murders that he had committed. Francis McDonald was 9 years old when he was also murdered by Albert Fish. During the night of July the 14th, 1924, Francis was reported missing by his parents when he failed to return home after playing catch with his friends in the Port Richmond neighbourhood of Staten Island. But it didn't take long before Francis's body was found. He was discovered hanging from a tree. Francis had been sexually assaulted before he was eventually strangled to death with his own suspenders. And Albert Fish later admitted to trying to castrate the boy after he had killed him. However, he took off when he heard people approaching the scene. So when police asked friends of Francis who were playing with him on the day that he disappeared, his friends said that he was taken by an old man with a grey moustache. A neighbour also told police that he saw Francis with a man who matched this description, an elderly man with a grey moustache, walking into the nearby woods. Francis's mother, Anna McDonald, said that she also saw this man earlier that day, and she told reporters, "He came shuffling down the street mumbling to himself and making queer motions with his hands. I saw his thick grey hair and his drooping grey moustache. Everything about him seemed faded and grey." This description from all these witnesses resulted in this mysterious stranger, who we now know was Albert Fish, being known as the Grey Man. The murder of Francis McDonald remained unsolved for years until Fish actually confessed after he was arrested and subsequently found guilty for the murder of Grace Bird. Another crime that Albert Fish admitted to after his arrest was the murder of 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. On February the 11th, 1927, Billy Gaffney was playing with his friend, also called Billy, in an apartment hallway in Brooklyn. However, later that day, Billy Gaffney disappeared, and when his friend Billy was asked what happened to him, where he had gone, he replied saying the boogeyman took him. Initially, serial killer Peter Kudinowski, I'm not really sure how to pronounce it, was a suspect in Billy's disappearance. However, he was ultimately ruled out. Then a witness named Joseph Meehan came forward to police and said that on the day of Billy's disappearance, he saw a boy that matched Billy's description with an old man. Joseph said that he witnessed this old man trying to stop this little boy from crying out for his mum. The little boy, who we now know was Billy Gaffney, was not wearing a jacket, and he was being dragged around by this old man on and off the Brooklyn tram. And when Albert Fish was arrested for the murder of Grace Bird and he admitted to the murder of Billy Gaffney, Joseph Meehan saw his picture in the newspaper and contacted police about the information about the tram and how Billy Gaffney was crying and stuff like that. However, Billy Gaffney's body has never been found. Police were able to establish that at the time of Billy's abduction, Albert was employed as a house painter by a Brooklyn real estate company during February of 1927. And on the day that Billy disappeared, Albert Fish was working only a few miles away from where he was kidnapped. When Albert eventually confessed to the murder of Billy Gaffney, he did it through a letter that he had wrote to his attorney. So I'm going to read you the first part of the letter that Albert wrote to his attorney describing Billy's murder and what he did with his body. I'm not going to read you the whole thing just because it is so disgusting and disturbing. It is available online if you do want to read it for yourself, but just be warned, it is really graphic. But again, if you don't want to hear this part, if you don't want to hear this part of the letter as well, skip to the time on the screen. So the letter says, I brought him to the River Ave dumps. There is a house there that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the boy there. Stripped him naked and tied his hands and feet and gagged him with a piece of dirty rag I picked out of the dump. Then I burnt his clothes, threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back and took the trolley to 59th Street at 2 AM and walked from there home. Next day, about 2 PM, I took tools, a good heavy of cat of 9 tails, homemade, short handle, cut one of my belts in half, slit these halves in 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. So like I said, I'm not going to read you the rest of the letter because it is so graphic and disgusting. But just to kind of sum up what it said, so Albert basically said in the rest of the letter that after he murdered Billy, he cut him up, cooked his body parts and ate them. Like I mentioned before, if you want to read the rest of the letter, you can Google it and it will come up in full, but just be warned, it is disgusting. So Albert Fish's trial for the murder of Grace Bird began on the 11th of March 1935 in White Plains, New York, and the trial lasted for 10 days. Just to make it clear here, so the reason that Albert was only trialed for the murder of Grace Bird is because he didn't admit to the murder of Francis McDonald and Billy Gaffney after the trial, so that's why he was on trial for the murder of Grace Bird and not those 2 children as well. Albert Fish pleaded innocent by reason of insanity because, like I mentioned earlier, he claimed to have heard voices from God telling him to torture and murder these children. The first witness who gave evidence in this trial was a man called Minas Gregory. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, I apologise. But Gregory was actually the manager of the psychiatric hospital where Albert Fish was treated in 1930. Gregory testified in court that when Albert was evaluated by the psychiatrist, it found that he was abnormal but sane. Another defense witness was Albert Fish's own stepdaughter, Mary Nicholas, who at the time of the trial was 17 years old. Mary described how growing up, Albert used to teach her and her brothers and sisters several games, including games about child molestation. Eventually, Albert Fish was found sane and guilty and he was sentenced to death. Albert Fish was executed on January the 16th, 1936 at Sing Sing Correctional Facility by electric chair. So the 3 children that were killed that I've talked about in today's video, Grace Bird, Francis McDonald and Billy Gaffney, are all confirmed and known victims of Albert Fish. However, a lot of people believe that he is responsible for a lot more than that. He is also suspected to have been involved with the murders / disappearances of 5-year-old Emma Richardson, 12-year-old Yetta Bromowitz, 6-year-old Robin Jane Liu, 16-year-old Mary Ellen O'Connor, and 17-year-old Benjamin Collins. And I couldn't actually find much information online about these cases, but I believe due to lack of evidence, he has never been successfully linked to these crimes. However, like I said before, a lot of people believe that he was probably involved in them. Albert Fish himself claimed to have had children in every state, and he stated at one time that his number of victims was around 100. And that is the end of this video. What do you think about this case? Do you think that Albert Fish probably had more victims, or do you think that he just killed those 3? Let me know in the comments. This case is honestly just one of the most disturbing cases I've ever looked into. When I was reading about it, I was just like, oh my god, it's literally horrifying. But yeah, that is the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Like I always say, if you want to request a case, head to the link in the description of this video and go and request one, and I might just cover it. I know I already said this at the start of this video, but thank you so much once again for 10,000 subscribers. It honestly means the world to me that people want to see more from me. It's really weird. Also, like I mentioned at the start of the video, I also now have a Patreon, so if anyone is interested in supporting me over there, I'll leave the link in the description. Also, what do you guys think of me doing a serial killer case once a month? I'm going to try and do one at least once a month, but they are the cases that take the longest to research, so I'm not going to put any pressure on it. I'm just going to kind of do them when I feel like it, but I'm going to try and do one once a month. So, but yeah, that is everything that I had to say, I think. So once again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again soon for another mystery with Molly. Bye guys.